Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, Episode 1. I am the show's host, Kyle. Typically, I would jump right into foreign policy news at the start of the show, but today I would like to give a little bit of background on the show and on myself since this is Episode 1. To start with some background about me, other than my name being Kyle, I'm an avid reader of the news. I read tons of news stories every day from all around the world, and I have found that what most of I watch on the news is either biased, incorrect, or a lot of important stories are just not covered. What I decided to do is start a website. That website is kylesfilesblog.com. Files is spelled F-Y-L-E-S. And what I do on that website is I produce a daily news roundup. My news roundups are typically 7 to 15 of the most important stories that occurred the day before. I try to summarize the stories down to maybe 2 or 3 lines. So if you just want to read real quick about what's going on, you could get a pretty good overview of the news without, reading thousands of words. But if you would like to read more, I always provide links to the stories at the end of my summaries. So you could get all the news you want. You could read it as detailed as you want easily on my site. In doing all this work for Kyle's Files, I discovered a rather disturbing trend of what's going on in the world and America's role in it, and just how terrible Americans' foreign policy is. So what I've decided to do is start a podcast focusing on foreign policy, where I bring foreign policy news and a little bit of commentary to my listeners. I hope that this podcast will help people to get a dose of what's going on in the world a few times a week and keep up to date on who America is dropping bombs on, when, and why. This brings us into my second topic that I want to talk about, which is why I decided to pick foreign policy for the topic of my podcast. Foreign policy, I think, is the biggest issue and probably the least covered and least important issue to most people. Most people are concerned about the economy, jobs, travel bans, walls, and all kinds of stuff. But a lot of these things have more to do with foreign policy than anybody would realize. America has spent trillions of dollars overseas on these foreign wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, now Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya. I could go on. All of these wars cost a lot of money because bombs aren't cheap, planes aren't cheap, aircraft carriers aren't cheap, military personnel by the thousands. It takes a lot of money. And so whenever you're looking at domestic policy and wondering why there's not money for program A, B, or C, a good place to start looking may be, well, how much is the military spending dropping bombs overseas? I often find that it's people on both sides of the aisle that completely ignore this point of how much money is being spent overseas, and nobody really wants to look into how much does a bomb cost? How much does it cost to float a fleet of ships over to the Red Sea? Or it costs a lot of money, and all that money adds up over time. I also want to cover foreign policy because I think it's the most undercovered story by the mainstream media. A lot of times Fox News or MSNBC will spend an entire hour of the day on what ridiculous thing Elizabeth Warren or Sean Spicer or any other big name politician in the U.S. said, but spend maybe 30 seconds at the most on who America bombed that day. I find that most Americans don't even realize that the U.S. was at war every single day under the Obama presidency, all 8 years, and that Obama bombed 7 countries. I think foreign policy is getting a little bit of light in the early days of Trump, but we'll see if this holds up while people are all glued to their TVs trying to see what new thing Trump will do each day, or if that fades as people start to go about their daily lives. Other issues with our foreign policy are just how many people die in that foreign policy. We could start by looking at the number of U.S. troops who are killed. Thousands have died in the Middle East since 2001. In Afghanistan and Iraq, a U.S. service member died in Yemen recently. All these deaths add up. The U.S. also kills millions of people who live in the Middle East. If you look at the numbers from the Iraq war, from Afghanistan, from the U.S. policy in Yemen, from U.S. policy in Syria, all of these deaths add and mount together and really create an anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. Even if America isn't directly responsible for all the death, at this point, they're directly responsible for so much death. I think everything kind of just gets blamed on the U.S. because were the boogeyman to the people who live in the Middle East. All those deaths of Middle Easterners really add up not only to a pretty severe moral toll, because it's disturbing that our government's killed so many people, but it really starts to impact the rights of everyday Americans. We're looking at building a wall on the southern border, banning people and limiting the freedom of movement of visa holders to the United States and people from countries. You can't go to the airport without walking through a full body scanner, and most of the time even getting a pat down. We have stop and frisk measures, the Patriot Act, the USA Freedom Act. We've tortured people. Obama gave the president the authority to be judge, jury, and executioner and order the murder of an American citizen. Americans are losing rights, and it's not because our politicians just want to take them from us. It's because after 15 years of endless war in the Middle East, it started to take a toll on the culture of America, and it's really amounting to a situation where we're losing rights very quickly. And if we look to the foreign policy, we're going to see why. And if we look and realize how dumb our foreign policy is and how inefficient it is and how ineffective it is, maybe we could stop it and start to get some of our rights back. I also think that America's foreign policy has really created a culture of fear in the United States. With so many U.S. service members having to go overseas, being separated from their families, some never coming back, some coming back with physical disabilities, other coming back with PTSD, developing addiction issues, and maybe even committing suicide, all this takes its toll on the culture of America. It's come to the point where we're banning people from certain countries, where we're building a wall on the southern border, where many Americans are just afraid to see a Muslim person in the airport. It kind of triggers a fear response. I think all this is because of the endless war, because of our foreign policy. It's not some innate hatred or racism of white people. It's not that Donald Trump made people afraid of Muslims. It's that all of our citizens have died or have spent time overseas because of, essentially the president telling us that Muslim people are so dangerous that we have to go bomb them by the thousands. Don't forget, Obama dropped 26,000 bombs in 2016. We have a situation in American politics where foreign policy is usually last on the list that people focus on. Economy, jobs, travel bans, always at the top of the list. Foreign policy is typically at the bottom of the list, yet it has the biggest impact on what's happening in America. And so shedding some light on that and maybe gaining some interest on that topic is one of the things I'm hoping to accomplish with this podcast. Some general information about the show. I'm going to try to produce episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Those episodes I'm going to try to keep to a half hour in length. I'm going to try to focus most of the podcast on foreign policy and how it affects us here in America. I'll try to focus on those on those global issues that affect Americans the most. So I'll spend more time talking about the war in Afghanistan than maybe the conflict between India and Pakistan, since U.S. troops are in Afghanistan and the U.S. has not quite so much to do with India and Pakistan. If you have any feedback, suggestions on the show, let me know. All my contact information will be on the show notes page. It's on my website. You can easily find it online. Send me a message and say, hey, your audio quality could be better. You talk too much. You don't talk enough. Talk too fast. Talk too slow. You should have a guest on. Whatever it is, let me know. I'll see what adjustments I make, what I can do to fix it. I am producing this show for the listeners. I'm not producing it for myself. I hear myself talk enough. If you would like to find the show, there are a few easy ways to do that online. One is going to kylesfilesblog.com. Files is spelled F-Y-L-E-S. On the menu bar, you'll see a podcast menu. And the weekly podcast I appear on called the Weekly Freedom File is there, as well as Foreign Policy Focus. If you click there, you'll get a list of the episodes and a link to all the episodes. You can also find the episodes on foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Going there will give you the media player and everything, so it'll be really easy to use. It has my cool little logo up there, a little overview of what's going on in the podcast. So look at it, share it around. hopefully get some people interested. If you like it, make sure you share it. It really helped me out. Places you can find me is on Twitter at KYAAALE. It's supposed to be a little South Park reference, but I don't know if the pronunciation always gets people right. And the other place is on Facebook. Facebook, search for Kyle's Files. Files again, FYLES. Hopefully you can find me there. And the last way you could reach me easily would be through the Libertarian Institute. I post my news roundups on the Libertarian Institute every day. That's libertarianinstitute.org. So check that out as well. Alright, finally getting around to the foreign policy news. We're going to start today with Afghanistan. So, Afghanistan, longest war in U.S. history. Afghanistan is going on year 16. This is 2007, 2017. U.S. troops got there in 2001, 16 years. This is what Obama called the good war. Well, I don't see what's so good about it. So what's going on there in the news now is that a U.S. airstrike in the Helmand province of Afghanistan killed 22 civilians. The airstrike apparently occurred during joint operations with U.S. and Afghani forces. They were fighting the Taliban in that province, and what likely happened is that Afghani forces called in an airstrike either on a Taliban position or on a position believed to be occupied by Taliban members. Unfortunately, there were either not Taliban members there or very few and mostly civilians, because we end up with a situation where 22 Afghani civilians are dead. Most of those dead are women and children. This certainly will not help the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East or the U.S. trying to achieve their goals. Whenever you have a situation where 22 women and children have died, the Taliban will take advantage of that situation, and they will try to use it as propaganda to get other people to give them money or join their ranks. I'm sure the Taliban members took pictures of all the victims, will tell a little story about each of the victims, whether it's true or not. Maybe they'll say they suffered from the American bomb, to really try to get people to hate America. And the more bodies we give them to do that, the easier it is on their side. We have a situation here where no matter how many people that airstrike killed, they're going to be able to radicalize more people with the bodies accumulated from the airstrike. They'll be able to get more money to buy more weapons. We're creating a bigger enemy by trying to defeat it. This is what I talked about when I said America's foreign policy is a cycle where we try to fix a problem and just make the problem worse, and we try to fix a problem and we make the problem worse. This happens over and over again. And unless we do something to change that foreign policy, we're going to end up in this same situation where we keep trying to fix our own messes and make a bigger mess. The other news coming out of Afghanistan is that the Afghani troops, in coalition with the U.S. military, will begin a mission to try to get ISIS out of the Nangarhar province. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This is a province in northeastern Afghanistan. It borders Pakistan. So it's probably, that border is pretty porous, so this is probably a place where any smuggling or anything going on between Afghanistan and Pakistan could happen. So that may be part of the motivation to why the Afghan government is looking to get ISIS out of this area. Unfortunately, they probably won't be very successful. This is the fourth operation to get ISIS out of this province since the start of 2016. What's happened in the past is that these forces will move in on the area and will actually be able to get ISIS out of the cities. ISIS will retreat to the countrysides, and to some extent maybe the Afghanis will try to eradicate them. What ends up happening is that after the Afghan military eventually reduces their presence or leaves the area, the ISIS fighters come back and take back control of the area. It's happened 3 times so far. A lot of times you'll see a situation where no matter how many people the Afghani or U.S. military is able to kill in these operations, more will be created because of situations like the story I talked about before where the U.S. killed 22 civilians. So even if the Afghan government is able to eliminate some ISIS fighters, ISIS no doubt is using those 22 dead civilians to talk to their neighbors and trying to radicalize people, trying to bring them to the cause. And even if we are able to kill a few in the operations, more will come back next time. Today in Afghanistan, the Taliban control more of the country than any time since 2001. They're growing in numbers, they're growing in strength, they're taking major cities. The U.S. is sending more troops to Afghanistan to try to combat this. In fact, the U.S. top commander in Afghanistan recently said that they need a few thousand more troops to break the stalemate in Afghanistan. So this could be another situation where we're looking at a surge like Obama did when he took office. And if you look where it got us now, it didn't get us anywhere since the Taliban have taken more of the country than they had before. Once again, this is costing money. We have soldiers over there. Their soldiers are getting paid. We have the U.S. planes over there. Planes need maintenance. Planes need fuel. Planes drop bombs. All these things are very expensive. Those bombs and planes and soldiers end up killing civilians, and those civilians' deaths are used to radicalize more people and create more hatred for the American citizens. And so this is just all compounding, and it's all getting worse. And maybe one day I'll have some good news that America has said, all right, we're done in Afghanistan, but I don't see that coming out of Trump. Moving over to Syria, things have been a little bit more quiet in Syria since the rebels being kicked out of Aleppo by the Syrian government, but there is still some fighting going on in Syria. A lot of that fighting is going on actually between the Syrian rebels. Most of the rebels ended up in the Idlib province, which is in northwest Syria, and in that province, some of those rebel groups were invited to peace talks, others weren't. The groups that weren't invited to the peace talks were the more jihadist groups, into the radical extremist Islam. So what has occurred is a lot of infighting between the groups that were invited and the groups that weren't invited to the peace talks. At this point, those two sides have formed coalitions, with the extremists forming the stronger and bigger coalition and really killing off a lot of the groups that were invited to the last round of peace talks. This is certainly going to make it very hard for any resolution to the Syrian civil war ever to come about, because if you kill off all the moderate or more moderate rebels, you're going to end up with a situation where the Syrian government really has nobody to negotiate with, because I don't think they're going to negotiate with Al-Qaeda. In other news around Syria, Turkish troops are working to enter the city of Al-Bab. Turkey entered Syria. Turkish troops are fighting in Al-Bab to get rid of ISIS. ISIS has had control of the city for quite some time. This is kind of on Turkey's road to Raqqa. Raqqa is the capital of ISIS, and Turkey is looking to retake Raqqa from ISIS. At least this is all according to Turkish President Erdogan. He recently had a conversation with Trump, so I'm guessing a lot of this is being done with the blessing of Donald Trump. It's going to create an interesting problem because Syrian Kurdish fighters are on their way to Raqqa and have made a little bit more progress towards the city than the Turkish troops had so far. So we'll see what happens when Turkey confronts the group that they probably hate more than ISIS, the Syrian Kurds, and whether or not they'll fight the Kurds or if they'll all work together to get rid of ISIS. One of Trump's first moves in office was to give the Syrian Kurds some heavily armored vehicles, and we could end up with a situation where our allies in Syria, the Syrian Kurds, are fighting our NATO allies in Turkey. So that will definitely be a story to watch. Syria is quite the mess, and it's definitely something that we need to keep our eye on. I'm sure I'll have a lot of news for you about Syria as the show goes on and progresses. Moving around the Middle East, we get to Yemen. There's currently a civil war going on in Yemen. On one side of the civil war, you have the rebel group known as the Houthis. On the other side of the conflict in Yemen, you have forces loyal to Yemen's president in exile Hadi. You also have Al-Qaeda with a significant presence in Yemen, controlling a lot of territory and generally causing problems for both sides of the conflict. ISIS is growing, or ISIS and Al-Qaeda are more of a merged group in Yemen, unlike in Syria where they may fight each other and at times but never work together. Where in Yemen they do work together and fight together and are basically the same group. These groups are becoming more powerful and taking territory in Yemen, so it's a big cause of concern for Yemeni citizens, and should be a cause of concern for the United States, because Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is the Al-Qaeda group that operates in Yemen, is one of the most dangerous and has committed more attacks against America than most other Al-Qaeda groups. So in Yemen, Saudi Arabia has also evolved, and what they are doing is they are waging an air war against the Houthis and also have a blockade of Yemen. This has created a humanitarian crisis because humanitarian aid really isn't able to get into Yemen, especially northern Yemen where the airstrikes are occurring. With that humanitarian crisis comes a situation where most people don't have access to the medications they need. This has really become a problem for cancer patients in northern Yemen, where they don't have any chemotherapy or other drugs needed at the hospitals, and so people are having to go and search on the black market for cancer drugs in Yemen. A lot of people don't have a lot of money, and they have to rely on charity to get the drugs when and if they could find them. So it's really not a good situation in Yemen on a humanitarian level. There's hundreds of thousands of children that are acutely malnourished and are at risk of dying because they don't have the food to eat. Over half of the country's population is in need of humanitarian aid. I believe that's about 14 million people. Only 40% of the medical facilities in the country are operating, which is an extremely bad situation for a country that is in the middle of a civil war. It's also very dangerous because Saudi Arabia is really indiscriminately bombing Yemen. They continue to hit houses, kill civilians, target civilian infrastructure. They once bombed a funeral and a wedding. Over the weekend, or early last week, when they bombed a home in the city of Al-Moka, and that home was a civilian home. At least 6 people in that home were killed, as well as it severely injured a doctor who runs a local non-for-profit organization that treats and tries to help some of the people that are victims of this war. That doctor being injured is a big deal because, like I said before, only 47% of the medical facilities in Yemen are operational. So this is causing, or will cause, a bigger problem. Last on my list for today is Somalia. While this isn't necessarily the direct result of U.S. intervention now, there is a very close to famine situation in Somalia. This is mostly caused because of a severe drought for the past 2 years. Where we can talk about U.S. foreign policy, though, the situation in Somalia will probably be a lot worse because of the power of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. U.S. foreign policy killed off a lot of the other powerful groups in Somalia. There was an Islamic Courts Council that fell apart, mostly at the direction of the United States, and what was left after that was the group Al-Shabaab. The last time Somalia faced a famine, Al-Shabaab made it very difficult for aid to be distributed to people in the country and really prevented people from going and seeking out aid. In Somalia, 6.2 million Somali civilians are in need of humanitarian assistance, with over 300,000 children acutely malnourished. We're at a situation where, like I said, the presence of Al-Shabaab is going to make it very difficult for aid to get distributed. Also, there's a growing ISIS presence in the country, which probably make it very difficult to distribute aid as well. So with all that, I think that's the foreign policy news that I'm going to talk about today. In the future, I'll cover other countries as well as update these stories and anything new that's going on. To close out the podcast, I'd just like to say thank you all for listening to my first podcast. Any feedback, ideas you have on how I can make the podcast better, let me hear it. If you want to listen to this podcast or subscribe, I will have it out on iTunes. You will be able to find it on my website. That again is kylesfilesblog.com. You'll be able to find it on Facebook, facebook.com/kylesfiles. I'll be sure to tweet it out so you could listen to it on Twitter at KYAAALE, or you could go to my Liberated Syndication page, which is a website that's hosting my podcast, and that will be at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Thank you all for listening.